Over the years, we've been trained to navigate two different realities. From the moment we're born, we learn to explore our world through our senses. We're able to touch, to see, to hear. We can even taste our surroundings. At the same time, most of us have learned how to use computer at some point in our lives. We look at things like this, and we understand what each icon, what each glyph will do if we interact with it. These two worlds have coexisted parallel to each other for a really long time. And I guess for the most part in this room, we all have been trained in technology after we have trained to actually understand our surroundings. However, new generations, they don't really know this distinction. Unlike me, newborns are introduced to technology very early on in their lives. They're learning both worlds at the same time, and not necessarily in the same order that we did. This is, for instance, a picture of my son I captured 3 weeks ago when I realized he was mesmerized just looking at my wife's iPhone. What I thought was more interesting is that only like 3 minutes later, I was able to capture this other picture where he seems to have discovered his hand for the first time. It was crazy. He was aware of the existence of an iPhone before he knew he has hands. So with the evolution of technology, the way we interact with the world and the way we interact with our digital environment is getting closer and closer. With VR, for instance, we're about to cross the line that divides or that separates basically the user and what they're interacting with. We believe this trend will continue in the future to a point where we won't be able to distinguish what is real or what is digital. And especially because kids will learn both worlds at the same time, we believe this distinction between these two different realities will become irrelevant. So with that said, my team's chart at Microsoft is to anticipate and embrace this future reality by understanding what patterns shape our perception of the real world and how can we take advantage of them today in our current interfaces. With Fluent Design, we're trying to reinforce that connection that could exist between our real world and our 2D interfaces to solve real user experience problems like hierarchy, focus, or continuity. Long story short, we want you to be able to use what you know from this world when you're using your personal computer. And this is basically about leveraging this concept of natural user interfaces by Bill Buxton. We believe that if we're able to exploit the skills that our users have acquired in the world over a lifetime, we'll be able to reduce the cognitive load that takes to digest a new interface, and therefore will minimize the distraction. So with that said, I would like to walk you through 3 different examples that have inspired the team to actually reinforce this connection between these 2 different worlds. I'm going to be talking about color and depth, materials and light, and I'll finish with sounds. So regarding color and depth, something that inspired the team to make technology more natural is basically is how we perceive the world and what properties of that spatial understanding could be actually leveraged to perform better in a 2D interface. So in the real world, everything is distributed in a 3D environment, right? The hierarchy of the objects around you is indicated through properties like scale, distance, perceived motion, or their contextual value. Looking at this picture, you should be worried about bumping into this person, but you should be probably paying more attention to the red light, the green light, that is letting you know that you can still cross the crosswalk safely. If we bring this closer to what would be a workstation, in the real world, if you're like sitting, working with certain things, that hierarchy of objects is communicated via the distance, right? The distance between the object and the subject. You could basically conclude that the objects that are closer to the subject are those that are being used more often, versus the others that are like far in the background. At this point, they're more like props. So if we bring this even closer to actually, the paradigm that we've been trained for the last 30 years of computing, of this desktop metaphor and 2D planes that basically host different apps, and we place that in a 3D environment, you can see that there are certain effects that already start to happen. And we thought that was actually pretty interesting. So in the real world, distance equals scale and depth of field. And while that is something that we don't even realize that we're scanning a room for the first time, it doesn't really work if you put that on a 2D interface. It suddenly creates a really linear way to browse and perform actions. Therefore, it doesn't allow for multitasking, or it doesn't let you be really productive and get things done. So if we take those effects out of the equation, and we change the camera from perspective to orthographic, so you actually don't have that distortion in space, even though it looks a bit more familiar to what we have today, there are certain lighting cues that we believe were really interesting because it already started communicating that 3D environment. So our representation of apps in the desktop metaphor could go from something like this, which is pretty much what we have today in every OS out there, to something closer to this. A wider variety of smart shadows that first communicate better depth and help indicate hierarchy and facilitate focus by putting up front what you're interacting with the most. So just like in the real world, but still keeping this window-based legacy that we've been trained to understand for the last 20 years. Another effect that we think is really interesting is this phenomenon called atmospheric perspective. In the real world, the illumination of a scene captures the colors of the environment and applies them to the objects in that environment with a slightly different tint. You see that if you're trying to take a picture of a rolling hill, right? If you're trying to take a picture of a mountain that is really far, even on a clear day, you're going to see this blue tint gets applied to the object, right? So this is something that happens in the real world, but it's been used for centuries in fine arts, right? In the Mona Lisa, you see that in the background as a way to make the scene feel more integrated, the subject, and make sure we focus our attention on what matters, which is the subject in this case. So if we apply that to our 2D windows, we could go from something like this. Well, the first thing that we need is a background, so we could use the same one we had before. And now, if we apply this tint, again, you can see how objects start getting pushed in the distance. And again, this is the dominant color of the composition. So if we change that background to, let's say, be warmer, that tone will change. If it is cooler, it will change as well. We believe that by using real visual effects that match our real-world perception, like depth and light in our 2D environment, we hope to reduce the cognitive load that takes to digest this complex modern UI that we're exposed every day, help increase focus, and help communicate a better hierarchy. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is materials and light. Now that we have a better understanding of what this environment is like, let's pay attention to the objects in the environment. We believe that there's a gigantic opportunity no one is really taking advantage of to leverage some of those properties that objects have in the real world to the interfaces. So in the real world, every single manufactured object have materials and shape that communicate intent. Right? You understand them just by looking at their appearance or by touching them. You could close your eyes, touch something, feel that the material feels inviting and is meant to be used. Materials communicate so much that you can even understand them without looking at them. If we look at the evolution of the treatment that we've used from the beginning of graphic user interfaces, we've covered a wide variety of different executions, from extremely minimalistic to a richer set of graphics, to a point where it became skeuomorphic, to a point where we actually flipped the pendulum the other way around and everything became flat, and now we're getting into this dimensional UI. And it feels that even though we have explored all these variations, we haven't even scratched the surface of what materials could do in a digital environment. So with that in mind, the team actually started exploring what material properties could be useful in a user environment, in a either 2D or 3D environment, right? So they started asking questions like, what truly defines the color of an object? How do different materials deal with light and relate to each other in a composition? Or how is our perception getting distorted by different types of materials, especially if you start moving those objects in 3D? And something that was pretty relevant to, again, modern UI is how layering and position will affect the properties of those materials if you cluster them on top of each other. We realized that for materials to communicate in a digital world as much as they do in the real world, we needed to pay attention to two different things. The first is how are materials represented? How do they look? And again, we've done lots of different explorations of what this palette could be, and really only time and our users will be able to validate certain assumptions. This is just the beginning of the journey. This is just a snapshot in time. But the idea, the goal, is to be able to link these materials to UX affordances so users can almost like rely on muscle memory and understand what things are meant to do just by looking at them. The second thing that we need to pay attention to is, well, it's not only how they look, but how do they interact with, how do they feel when you interact with them or when they interact with other objects in a scene. And you can see, for example, here how it's impossible to really get a full idea of what a material could be like until the moment you see that material interacting with, for instance, the environment. In this other example, we call this reveal. Materials reveal properties when you actually shine light on top of them, right? So the cursor acts like a light source, and therefore only reveals certain properties when you're interacting with them, which again will declutter the UI and facilitate focus. And there's so much we could do. In this case, for instance, we're trying to understand intent. In the world of UI, normally we have been constrained to certain assumptions that basically affect our interaction. So for instance, we measure things like, oh, you hovering this button, or you're pressing, or you're releasing this button. But what if we could understand user intent and only reveal the properties of, let's say, a button when that button becomes relevant to the user in the composition? That way, we could actually declutter the UI and basically help them focus on content over this dance of call to actions competing with each other. There is so much we could do with materials. In the real world, materials communicate a lot. They're extremely important and essential to how we interact with the real world. Yet when you sit down in your computer, it feels like you're compromising. It feels like you're living a cheap version of what that could be. The more we believe we can leverage materials in an authentic digital way, the better we'll serve our users, and especially as we transition to fully immersive 3D environment. All right, so the last thing that I'd like to talk about is sounds in the context of notifications. Sound is an extremely important part of any design system, yet it's normally overlooked after the aesthetics and the behavior of it. We need sound if we want to create a multi-sensory experience. In the real world, sound is key to locate ourselves. It provides feedback, anticipation, and it gives us a spatial hierarchy. It is essential to how we navigate the world. Just try going out there with your headphones, let's say noise-canceling headphones. You're suddenly missing a gigantic part of what it takes to, what it makes you basically replace you in this world. Sound is also essential to how we communicate with others and how we communicate with, again, other parts of the world. Beyond the specific sound of words, every spoken language has musical patterns. And that melody and rhythm has an emotional meaning that has the power to create an emotional connection. So the sound team actually worked on this idea of analyzing the speech contour of a different set of languages to try to synthesize what could be a universal pattern that could be meaningful to everybody beyond the culture or country of origin of their language. The hypothesis was that if we can define the foundation of our sound system based on the emotional connection we have with others and with the world, we're going to be able to bring this gigantic piece of emotional connection we have with the real world in our digital interfaces. And that is really powerful. We'll be able to talk to a global audience as well. So what I want to do now, I want to share a few examples of that. This is, for instance, the reminder sound on Windows already. And this is basically the sentence they selected to come up with that sound. And we're going to listen to that sentence in different languages. So this is how it sounds in English.
Ready to go?
Japanese,
用意できた？
Mandarin,
你好了吗？
and Spanish.
¿Estás lista?
So hopefully you were able to already figure out the melody, identify the melody. But just in case, let's play all of them at the same time.
¿Estás lista?
That'd be crazy. All right, so from there, hopefully it doesn't happen. But from there, this is the abstract contour the team came up with. It's ready to go. And this is how it sounds in your desktop machine. Another example is new message. If you get a new message in Windows, this is basically this is how they got there. So new message in English.
New message.
French.
Nouvel message.
And Russian.
Новое послание.
And this is the abstract contour now. and how it sounds in your desktop. All right, so other examples are, for instance, getting a new mail, and the sentence was a message for you. Background alerts, everything is good. Everything is good. And foreground alerts, please look now. So this really, all these sounds, they already exist in Windows today. I encourage you to go and experience them for yourself. So finally, hold on a second. Hold on a second. I still have 1 minute. These are just really, everything that I just talked about, those are just really a few examples of what we're aiming for, right? We believe that by tapping into the human innate engagement that we have with the real world, but in a digitally authentic way, we're going to be able to create experiences that feel lighter, more natural, and actually that leverage our knowledge of the world. Again, remember, from the moment we're born, we are hardwired to understand everything around us. We're equipped to actually explore this world and understand what we have to do, right? So I guess a takeaway from me here for all the creators in the room and that might be watching this talk later is that it's important that we as creators look beyond the screen and get back in touch with those, what shapes our perception of the world, which is ultimately what makes us human. Thank you so much.